Again, it is my great privilege to have the opportunity to chair the distinguished panel. We have very distinguished panelists here from 3 countries. And actually, this panel is very carefully prepared because we have 2 presenters from each country, the United States, China, and ROK. And those 2 are composed of one panelist who major security field and the other economic field. So by just listening to their views, I think we can have a very big picture and clear picture about the issue that we are dealing with, that is the US-China relations in the future. This is really an ambitious topic, and it is probably very difficult to cover all the major issues embedded in this topic. But I think there are 3 important questions that interest us. First is, what is the cause of the current change in the US-China relationship? For example, is the US policy of engaging China a real failure, as many people in Washington, D.C. nowadays are talking about? And what was the reason, fundamental reason for this shift in the relationship between 2 most important, powerful countries in the world? And probably the next question that I have in my mind is, are we heading for a so-called new Cold War? What will be the future scenario? And will the conflict between 2 big powers inevitable? Or will there be any kind of compromise between those 2 big powers? Finally, what kind of prescription or policy recommendation we can think of? Probably this last question may be dealt with in the second round of presentations, which will be made by the presenters, each presenters. And I would like to recommend each panelist to spend 5 or 7 minutes in the first round representing their thinking about the issue of the future of the US-China relationship. And then probably we can have more time to discuss other issues. I would like to skip introducing all the participants because detailed bio, you can find it from your pamphlet. So please refer to that. And our first presenter is Professor Richard Cooper from Harvard University. Professor Cooper.
Well, thank you very much. I just learned a moment ago that my time has been cut in half from 10 to 15 minutes to 5 to 7 minutes. I'll try to adhere to that, but I'm not sure I'll be able to. Our topic this morning is reconfiguring US-China relations, and I'm only going to talk about that, not many other issues like North Korea. And in my view, I guess you could say my pessimistic view, we cannot refigure US-China relations with our current leaders. We need first to get rid of our 2 supreme leaders. They are both highly egotistical. They're both bullies. And like many bullies, they're both insecure, although I know much less about China. but from what I've observed, there's a high degree of insecurity in President Xi. The British ambassador to Washington, a highly seasoned diplomat, in a recently leaked cable, described Mr. Trump as inept, incompetent, and insecure. 3 words which capture my sentiment exactly from what I've been able to observe from outside Washington. My psychiatrist brother thinks that Trump is actually technically a psychopath. Fortunately, the American public has the opportunity within a year and a half of relieving Trump of his duties. That is not certain. Depends on who his opponents will be in the American election. And as we've learned many times, the election often is determined within the last 3 weeks of the election by events, some of which are influenceable by Trump himself. And I would not put it past him to produce some kind of surprise just before the election. But at least there's the possibility of doing that. Trump was totally unprepared to be elected president. He wanted the job, but he was unprepared. He'd campaigned mainly in opposition to his opponents and on slogans. And he discovered that it's really hard to translate slogans into policy, even while the slogans express some sentiments about policy. And then he discovered in his first year of office that American judges do not work for him, and he discovered that the American Congress does not work for him, although he had a success at the end of the year with his tax cut. This is the American system of checks and balances. I do not believe that Trump is himself a protectionist, but what he discovered with the help of his lawyers, imaginative lawyers, that he has the authority under the American system, and it's a flawed authority, but it exists, to raise tariffs on his own authority as president. So tariffs, he had more authority as CEO of the company that he owned than he did as a president of the United States. But he discovered that as president, he has the authority to raise tariffs. And he started to do that by now in, depending on how you count, about 6 rounds, counting around the world, not just China. And he has said recently he's a tariff man. What does that mean? Not that he likes tariffs, but he can control tariffs. I think he would be just as happy, maybe even happier, to see American exports of manufacturers especially increase than to reduce imports. But he cannot control exports, and he can influence imports through tariffs. So this is, I think, ideologically entirely instrumental in Trump's mind. Not in the case of all of his advisors, but as his advisors are divided on what the objective should be with respect to US-China relationships. But I think the tariff is instrumental, but he's enjoying using it as president. And I think he will not stop using it or threatening to use it until we get rid of him. Actually, that's my own view. Now, replacing Trump with somebody else will not solve the US-China issue. In philosophical terms, that's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader of the Senate, has been on China for over 12 to 15 years already, originally against currency manipulation by China, which was a plausible claim 12 years ago. It is not a plausible claim today. but there's a certain degree of wariness is a polite word. Hostility is probably too strong, but someplace in between among American politicians in Washington on both sides of the aisle, Democrats as well as Republicans, with respect to US-China economic relationships, leaving aside the South China Sea and other defense-related issues. So that a change of leadership in the United States, as I say, is not sufficient. If you look at American polls, the American public is not hostile to China. But it's hard to find a politician these days, American politician, who will stand out and stand up and support publicly a very positive relationship with China. But I guess I will save. I have a list of win-win, to use President Xi's term, areas which I will save to the second round.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Mr. Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Thank you. Thank you. I noticed we very strategically lined us up by nationality, so we're going to get the cranky Americans out of the way at the front of the panel. It's good to be in Seoul. I want to join Gary and my colleagues in congratulating the Che Institute and Park In-guk and also Chairman Che. I'm going to make 3 points in the also shortened time that I have. The first is about why I agree with Dick and others that we are at something of an inflection point in the US-China relationship. Second, I want to say something about the changing politics of China in the United States. And then last, I'll say something about the trade deal. On the inflection point, from my vantage point, the origin of the last few decades of American policy toward China really lie in an article in October 1967 that the then former Vice President Richard Nixon, who was contemplating another run for president, wrote, in which he talked about China being a country stuck in what he termed angry isolation that needed to be, as he put it, brought into the family of nations. And so for 8 presidencies thereafter, from Richard Nixon through Barack Obama, my view is that it wasn't really about engagement, but about integration. This notion of integrating China into the prevailing system from the kind of autarky that it was in has essentially been the functional basis of US policy. And for those 8 administrations, both led by Democratic and Republican presidents, a successful China was viewed as in the national interest of the United States. I would argue that the current administration, and many people in the United States increasingly do not view a successful China as being in the interest of the United States. A successful China defined as one that is more innovative technologically and scientifically, one that is growing rapidly, one that is expanding its profile, posture, and power abroad. It's not so obvious to me that either Republican or Democratic politicians necessarily think this is in the American national interest. And you can argue about whether they're being cynical, but there is a debate around that in the United States. So if a successful China is not in the national interest of the United States, what's happening? I would argue that the core of it has to do a little bit with the relationship between economics and security. We've always had different political systems, the United States and China, and we've had clashing and contending security concepts, particularly in East Asia and the Pacific. But for many Americans, and certainly for those 8 administrations, I think the prevailing view was that economic integration would at least mitigate security competition. But the United States and China are enormously economically integrated. They have a $700 billion plus trading relationship. There's more than 100 billion of US foreign direct investment stock in China. There's more than 50 billion of Chinese FDI stock in the United States. The people-to-people flows have been enormous. And so economic integration, which was supposed to mitigate security competition, not only is the security competition intensifying, but I would suggest to you that security is now bleeding back into the economic relationship in every dimension in ways that are potentially extremely debilitating and are precisely why I said this is a bit of an inflection point, because it will change things. So if you think about the things that flowed between the 2 countries in that economic relationship. It was essentially flows of goods, of capital, of people, and of technology. And on all four of those, policy steps are being taken by both governments in the United States and China that will at minimum disrupt those flows. Goods, it's tariffs and reciprocal and retaliatory tariffs. Capital, I'll just speak to the American side. I mean, in China we know about equity caps, joint venture requirements. But in the United States, new investment screening mechanisms and a much more skeptical view of investment from China. People, 1/3 of the foreign students in the United States are Chinese. They spend on average $26,000 per student. They spend 7 years in the United States. 40% of them are in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Increasingly through visa policies and other policy debates in the US federal government, that may change. And as we'll talk about throughout the day, the idea of a technology decoupling, at least in some sectors, is very much front and center in the United States. And there's an indigenization debate around technology in China too. So if you take out or at least begin to restrict flows of goods, capital, people, and technology, what's left? What's left is the security competition and the distinctive political and ideological systems. So that to me, this bleeding of security back into economics in all of those areas except for goods, because the security perspective is driving a lot of the thinking around investment, around technology, around people flows in the United States. That's a sea change. And so that could change the nature of the US-China relationship, but it's not easy to come back from. And that brings me to my second point. There's a lot of talk that as a result of that, there's a new consensus in Washington for a much tougher and more confrontational approach toward China. I've just moved back to Washington after 7 years living in the Midwest. And there certainly is an enormous amount of agreement in Washington, as Dick suggested, among Democrats and Republicans alike around China. DC people tend to think that if they agree on something, that means there is a consensus. There may be a DC consensus, but there is no American consensus, as you just heard Dick Cooper say. When you get outside of Washington, mayors of cities, governors of states, mid-cap companies, for whom expansion into China is a critical part of the growth strategy, because China's deploying technologies to scale like no other country, these interest groups continue to pursue productive, expanding relations with China. And so it begs the question, what are the politics going to look like? I think the old constituencies that supported the kind of policy the United States has had over the last several decades, foreign policy elites, large multinational corporations, financial interests, these are not, as you may have noticed, as supportive of the so-called engagement policy as they once were. Among companies, for example, it has a lot to do with a sense of impatience and disappointment with the pace and scope of reforms in China. It's 18 years since China acceded to the World Trade Organization. But if you're an investment bank on Wall Street, you're still waiting for the ability to have a 100% ownership of a financial services company. The equity caps have gone up. You're at 51% now, but you're still in a joint venture at 51. So the politics are going to change, and the question for me is, if there's no constituency for cooperation, does that mean there's a constituency for confrontation? It's not so clear to me. And so I think that's going to play out. One piece that's unpredictable is, as I said, when you get out of Washington, what will Americans support or not support? But the other is our president himself, who is mercurial, unpredictable, and where there isn't a lot of coherence in the approach to China at the top. And that brings me to my last point. For about a year, people thought there was going to be a trade deal. I didn't really think there was going to be a trade deal. Now I actually am more and more optimistic side, because I think, as Dick Cooper said, and I agree, I don't think a trade deal would resolve a lot of the underlying issues. But at least it would put a floor under the free fall that we now see in the US-China relationship. And for this president, who's not easy to analyze, but seems to look at things through a political prism and is approaching an election, he at least has some interest in trying to tell a story to his electoral base, or the segment of the electoral base that he cares about the kind of possibilities that he has enabled with China. People often ask why he's so focused on China buying things the trade deficit in goods. My own view is if you look at the kind of things that China would buy in a purchase deal, and you look at the geography of those sectors in the United States, and then you lay a map of the Electoral College on top of it, there's some method to the madness. Agribusiness, it's states like Iowa that voted twice for President Obama, then flipped to President Trump. A lot of the mid-scale tech I was talking about, things like medical devices, that's states like Ohio, Michigan, the states that made him president. So there's some method to that. What we learned from the Mexico example in the last month or two is that the president can make a trade deal and then change his mind a few weeks later and threaten to reimpose tariffs for something completely unrelated to the trade deal. So he has every incentive, in my view, to try to take a deal to the electorate, and then if it doesn't work and give him the polling bounce that he wants, as with the Mexican case, he will try to tell a different story to the electorate. He's very mercurial and unpredictable in that sense. And so I think we'll have to see, but if I were betting, I would say that he'll take a run at it. But as Dick said, it doesn't really change any of these underlying things that I talked about. And that's what I think we ought to talk about a little bit when we talk prescriptively, is if security is bleeding and those flows of things that were positive are changing, how do we either arrest that or mitigate the impact of that? Because if we don't, then as I said, I think we're at an inflection point where we may not be in free fall, but we're headed for a downward spiral in the relationship that's much more competitive and much more disruptive.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Chang Yul-ling, professor at Chinese Academy of Social Science.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm glad to come back again for the fourth meeting. Concerning China-US relationship, I think the whole changed configuration. I think if you compare to some years ago, especially after Xi on the power, and generally I think China working for the best. So it liberates many new ideas. But now, to my sense, it's working for the worst. So I think this is a big change. The confidence, trust has a fundamental change for the two relations, I think. Now, I think this is a big challenge. Concerning this economic relations, I think we have two kinds of analysis. One is, I call it technical. Technical analysis, you see, following these trade disputes or called the trade war, you have seen already some structural changes from both sides, from US import and China's export, and there are the redirection of the trade in many areas already happened. But one issue is very clear. It has not helped much of the China-US trade imbalance. So that shows something behind that is basic structure of the two economies still there. It's not changed a lot. But there are some, very big impact, like block Huawei. It seems no reason at all. Some reason, but it seems no reason. But the sudden big policy just, try to suspend all the business, get out of Huawei in the US market. But it's a way of doing. It's really, it's a great impact for the future economic relations. Also great impact for the production supply chain network already we have. That is why so many American companies, applied for the special alliance and just yesterday or day before, the Ministry of Department of Trade has changed and lifted more than 100 kinds of, so such kind of thing, you see, is unreasonable. If impact to also the other countries, now we see, Japan, Korea case. So many others, you can unwillingly to do something without any of thinking of basic rules, and existing relations and interests even some. That is, I think, trade relations, I think, is really has a great impact on the current and on the future. Because generally in the past, for several decades, we have established almost a rule-based, well-recognized standards. Something you cannot do that, something you can do. But now it seems no any kind of boundary. You can do whatever you like. So this is, I think, great danger for a highly integrated regional bilateral world size of the economy. Second, about the strategic analysis of China-US relationship. As I mentioned, after Xi's group, they want to build a good relation, or the best relation even, to set up a model, and for the two big powers, they can work together and promote the direction for the world to a good direction after the Cold War. But now seems a quite different direction. So this is also great impact on that. So it seems we don't know what about the future of the world of the region if the situation like this. There is no strategic cooperation between the two powers or a group of powers on the many important global issues and regional issues. They need to work, except probably to some extent on the Korean Peninsula, on North Korea nuclear. But I don't know whether they still can cooperate together at all. So I think this change, again, it's also make our future unpredictable, uncertainty. And also we see bilateral relations. Many people worried about how far they can go. But Trump's policy now is not just on the trade, but also on the political, on science, prevent and block the Chinese young students to study in the United States, and isolate Chinese, scientists, all out of the centers, and so the whole mood, I think, that is a fundamental change. So that is why I said, the working have to work for the worst. Working for the worst is very dangerous. They can take a lot of different approaches, and the unpredictable things on each side. I think that's worrisome. And for instance, many Chinese families, they still now preparing. They just 2 days ago, a mother called me, so whether you can help, because her daughter prepared everything for study in the United States. Get a permission, pay tuition and everything, but only, and rejected, and to study. So I said, I have any way to help you at this moment. So this is general, I think, change. If you see after China's opening and reform, and that's a great achievement of bilateral relations, because each year there are so many young generations, and now most of them now coming back, become the backbone in many areas. But what about the future? If this from now on they highly reduce the potentials for young generations to study. And also we have an emerging new trend in the past years. The American young people increasingly try to study in China, but now is also has a change. So what kind of a world, what kind of a future about? As mentioned by my two previous American speakers, so we don't know whether Trump will be re-elected even after Trump, and what kind of American policy, what kind of bilateral relations for these two big giants. So I remember once Deng used to say, he said about the China-US relationship, if it goes too good, maybe not so good. If it goes to the bad, maybe not so bad. But now somebody said already, it goes to the bad, but maybe very bad. So that is, I think, the way of thinking. Lastly, concerning these economic issues, I think there are still at least three questions we have to think about. One is global trade balance and imbalance in face of a dynamic change of a global economy. How to manage? So trade imbalance between bilateral and especially U.S. role, how to figure that in the future. The second about WTO, multilateral system, how to reform it in facing of a new technological development, in facing of a new emerging economies and the direction. And what about U.S. role? And just not to reject, but they have to contribute to their direction. Also, there is an urgent need now. We have to do something by the end of the year. That's a third one. I think about the global economy. The globalization, economic integration almost become a real phenomenon of global economic. But now we have a new technological revolution, and the future world economy need a new kind of more integrated global market. But how to facilitate and support this new direction, we also have to think about to make the new rules. So there are already challenges in trade, in currency, in many areas. So there are a lot of urgent, big issues we need on the global level to cooperate, especially among the big powers, and to take real actions. But unfortunately now we are focusing too much on this kind of bilateral and specific issues. I think that's another big danger we have to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next speaker is Professor Chu Chi, professor at Dongchi University.
I'm very glad to be invited to attend this discussion. The topic is the trade war between China and the US and Sino-American relations. First, I'd like to analyze the US. The linkage between the trade war or American trade policy and American, the international strategy or strategic thinking about China. Under the guidance of Trump trade doctrine, trade has become the most important area the Trump administration is concerned about in Sino-American relations. Trump declared that his goal was to make the US great again, and the method to pursue this aim is America first. Two guiding documents of the US National Security Strategy Report, which is published in December 2017, and the US Defense Strategy Report published in January 2018, China and Russia are both referred to revisionist competitors. It says, they say China and Russia challenge U.S. power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. The U.S. security report, defense security report, strategy report even says interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern of the U.S. National security. It can be said the two reports are full of prejudice against China, completely illustrate China negatively, and totally denied U.S.-China policy over the past 20 years. So we also heard in October 2018, U.S. Vice President Pence speech at the Henderson Institute, which was full of unwarranted accusation against China. So I would say if the U.S. has held such views of China in the past 20 years, the development of Sino-American relations to date would not have been possible. If these are real views of China held by U.S. policy makers, the efforts that China and the U.S. have made to build up mutual trust and in recent years would be unrealistic expectation. Unfortunately, in fact, some more rational voice in the U.S., such as voice from Henderson Paulson, the former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who was actively committed to promoting Sino-U.S. economic and trade relations, is even more worrying and more pondering. Paulson's speech in Singapore in November 2018 may represent overwhelming partisan judgments on China and the U.S. It says, there are a few judgments about China. First, there are a lot of problems and differences between the U.S. and China. Even in the economic field, the challenges are not limited to trade issues. However, these problems and the disagreements were not addressed before the Trump administration. Second, if China and the U.S. cannot reach agreement to solve the current dispute, there will be a risk that the economic iron curtain will fall to the world economy. Third, there are many influential figures in the United States who advocate to de-link the U.S. and the China economy, especially in technology-related trade and investment. Fourth, the most important competitive area between China and the U.S. is high technology, because this is the key to gain economic advantage and to promoting national security. Fifth, with the support of the state, China may gain the advantage of high-tech development, so the United States must stop it in advance. Sixth, since the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, China has consciously expanded its own development model to the third world and spread its various standards to other regions through plans such as Belt and Road Initiative. So we can see that it's why that trade war, especially one related to technology, high-tech field, has become the critical part of the U.S. strategy toward China. And it is also the best consideration the basic consideration of the Trump administration's strategy towards China. It's also necessary to pay attention to the fact that the United States distinguished China's unfair trade into two parts. One is the specific imports and exports products and the quantity. The other involves structure issues that are more profound and more difficult to resolve, such as mandatory transfer of intellectual property rights, market access, governmental subsidies, and cyber attacks. A particular striking problem is that the notion and the national security competition is widely infiltrating into the economy and the commerce, is being implemented by the US government. Excluding Huawei from the procurement list of next generation of the 5 wireless communication equipments may be a concrete action. Recently, relatively good news is that after more than 1 month's dialogue, the two presidents of the two countries met at G20 summit in Osaka, and two sides agreed to renew the negotiation in trade. Now we need to pay attention to some questions. Although the U.S. relations has yet split into a new Cold War, which is our judgment, or delinking, they are already at a turning point, and impossible to return to the past, as Kissinger suggested. As the US has determined that China has become an equal competitor of the United States, and China's rise has already harmed the US national security. But it has to be emphasized that in an area of globalization, the delinking of the economies, like in the Cold War, is in the violation of economic law. Globalization has led to interdependence of the world economy, and using anti-globalization method to deal with US-China trade issues, completely delinking the US and China economy, and transferring all investment and trade out of China are not beneficial to the United States. It is noted that some American reporters pointed out that we will never return to the era before Trump. At that time, we have a general feeling that China and the US will abide by global standards and reach a systematic consensus, so that we will have integration of global supply chain, a global technology industry. Now the market should expect two technology ecosystems to emerge in the end, one for the West and the other for China and some emerging market countries. So we will ask, is the tech Cold War is a new form of Cold War, of the new form of the Cold War, the new Cold War, and we should ask ourselves. It deserves us to think about seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Choi Byung-il, Ewha University.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be part of this trilateral process. Let me start with making 3 predictions about the future. When I was making this prediction a year ago, I was a minority, and a lot of people criticize me, I'm not to be rational. But now, I think what I'm trying to tell you is a majority assessment. That is a trade war between two great economies. It's not going to end anytime soon. I even dare to say it may persist even beyond Trump era, whether he's going to be reelected or not. Because when Trump decided to initiate trade war based on a tariff hike, I think economic rationality is already taken a backseat, because U.S. is determined to some distance to test China's resolve, whether or not it can modify system or it can change its behavior. So to my perspective, it is not Trump who initiated trade war. I think both two countries, the equally responsible is China's Xi Jinping, who failed to move China on the path toward more reform and opening up. So because of the structural reasons and domestic politics, I tend to believe a trade war will not end anytime soon, even though, as both American participants predicted, Trump tried to make some deal, but he declared, I won the game, but that he may soon to change words because China is not likely to implement there's certain chance. So that's one prediction. And second prediction is, while trade war is occupying a lot of headlines, but it is only one element of what is going on between two countries. So already trade war is not only one battlegrounds. There are many more battlegrounds, investment, capitals, and competition for talent and education, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, both countries are already into economic Cold War, maybe early stage of Cold War. So, but the worry is if they are going deeper and deeper, very difficult to coming back and out of this, the digging the wall or digging the hole for economic Cold War. Third prediction is, no matter what happens, trade war, I think technological hegemonic competition between two countries will continue, because we are already moving into so-called disruptive technology eras, often called as fourth industrial revolutions, especially technology with huge security implications. So this is going to be so-called a new normal. And how far will it go? No one has a crystal ball. I think what is happening is posing tremendous challenge for China. So in a sense, I think China is facing moment of truth, because Chinese economy is already deep into structural difficulty. Even though they're posting numbers like 6% annual growth, a lot of experts on Chinese economy pointing China is facing a lot of enormous difficulties. So to avoid China's falling into middle income trap, I think the Chinese government, they transform economic development strategy from perspiration-based economy to inspiration-based economy. And innovation is very key. But because of the outbreak and persistence of US-China economic Cold War, the people's having a lot of doubt whether or not China can continue to innovate without having access to US market and US key technology. So in that regard, I think US has become very, very strategic. I think game plan for USA is quite obvious as far as Trump is concerned, because too many US inside the Beltway policymakers, to their view, game rule is totally inadequate. World Trade Organization proved incompetent to deal with economy like China with a state-led economy. And also referee, to their views, incapable and even unfair. And also the playing grounds is very uneven. So they want to change all three things altogether. The question is, China is willing to change. Well, I think China is willing to change some of those if they believe it is good for Chinese economy. And also it is good for maintaining their political system. So I think that is posing enormous, the question to continuation of Chinese political economic system as it is. So here the key question is, how far can US push China? So I think Washington is having debate whether or not we can change the Chinese system. I think chances are rather slim. So I think another possibility is, if you cannot change Chinese system, can you change Chinese behave? So I think that is ultimate question US need to address. So here the key variable is whether or not US political system, which is going through every 2-year election, is capable of pushing China to the end continuously. I think I have significant doubt. On the other hand, question for China is, can China continue to make economic performance? For instance, as I said, without having sufficient access to US market for trade and for technology, for talent, can China continue to create sufficient basis for innovations? So far, global ecosystem for technology, I tend to say that there was two Silicon Valley. One Silicon Valley is in California, another Silicon Valley is in China, Shenzhen. And Silicon Valley in USA, they provided the key original source technology. But because of a lot of complex regulations, China become the place for test bed and testing the commercial viability of all these original ideas. And then if that is done in a very speed way and very effective way, then US and China, the people team together and come up with innovations, come up with a product. I think that global ecosystem is going to be fragmented along the possibly ideological line. So in the end, I'm not going to be surprised you're going to have US-led ecosystem on technology and China domestic ecosystem. And here the question is, what is going to happen, decision move of other country like Korea, or Japan, and European Unions. So eventually, what will happen in this US-China economic Cold War is going to be determined by interaction by three factors: politics, market, and technology. Well, I think it is time that politics, which is seeking for dominance or win or lose, has taken driving seat, and on the other hand, the market has taken the back seat, and technology is not going to be ideologically neutral anymore. But based on history, in the end, it is market which will say whether or not this competition is going to take a certain form. As we have seen the case of early 20th century, even though the surge in competitive protectionism, but if it was not sustainable because of market system. So to conclude my talks, no one knows what will happen at the end of the day, and I think it will rest on how two systems will respond to two questions. That is, how far US can push China, and second is how long China can endure US pressures. I think for the time being, China tried to reform to some extent and tried to endure and tried to resist. So they tried to combine all three systems. In the meantime, China should produce certain economic deliverable to the people. So I think that's key questions. In the meantime, I think we are living in very chaotic situations. That is where rule-based system doesn't mean much, and also the huge nexus between security and trade, and also rise of geoeconomics. That means countries, not only US, China, but other countries like Japan, they're willing to tolerate other countries to achieve political gains. And so that is new world we're going to live in for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last but not the least, Professor Chung Jae-ho from Seoul National University.
Thank you. When the GDP of the United States reached 70% of United Kingdom in 1840s, nobody really paid attention to the United States. China's GDP is about 70% of the United States at this point, but we're already talking about hegemony competition, power transition, two-city death trap, and so on and so forth. So I guess my good friend Tom Christensen of Columbia University was correct in predicting nearly 20 years ago China can and does pose threat without quite catching up. I think the term superpower was coined by a scholar, again from Columbia University, whose name was William Fox. But in 1944, when he coined the term, he included US, USSR, and UK as superpowers. But 10 years later, when Morgenthau came up with his second edition of Politics Among Nations, he deleted UK. And he gave us the rationale for defining superpower. Superpower should not be judged only in terms of the power the country has, but also the superpower has to be judged in terms of the power gap between the first and second power on one hand and third and the rest on the other. So I think that is exactly what is happening right now. The power gap between the US and China is being narrowed down, although more slowly than expected. But the power gap between the US and China on one hand and all the other powers is widening. So that is what is happening. So I think the structural settings have been laid out for hegemony competition, on top of the worsening perceptions between the US and China, particularly since 2017, and particularly regarding US perceptions of China. So I would say intermittent sutures are likely and possible, but ultimate resolution of the problem between Washington and Beijing is not very likely until the final winner is officially recognized. I don't know what kind of process will be required to make that recognition. I don't want to say that, but just back from Beijing 2 days ago, when I was in Beijing, a friend of mine gave me a report about a military researcher at National Defense University who had an interview with the Asahi Shimbun. And this person is very famous because his concept of China Dream was adapted by President Xi Jinping and became the national goal since 2013. And this person gave an interview to Asahi Shimbun and said, China's goal is to overtake the United States in 30 years. And he laid out what China would do and what US-China relations are likely in each of the 3 decades from now on up to 2040s. And he specifically said in the decade of 2040s, China will finally gain an upper hand vis-a-vis the US and will build a more civilized international order. So this says it all, you know, the China dream is not very compatible with America first. So structurally and perceptually, I think this stage is set for more intense competition and serious confrontation between the two. Now on the United States front, I think it is a cliche to say that commonalities that you can find about UK-US relations are completely lacking in terms of US-China relations. History, language, ethnicity, culture, civilization, and so on and so forth. So this tends to generate more fears among the Americans about the emergence of a new order. But that doesn't justify a situation where United States, I mean, as mentioned in one of the introductory remarks, that you overplay the identity politics. You know, you shouldn't overplay a sort of the necessity of a sort of racial fight in the disguise of civilizational clash. That will cause an enormous backfire, in my view. There was a recently interesting article in the Washington Post. The policy planning staff in the State Department is preparing a letter X. I hope that doesn't really happen. But you know, if it does happen, I hope it doesn't really overplay the identity politics that I just said. Another one is how much of what the United States is doing right now vis-a-vis China is considered overreaction that goes way beyond something that can be categorized as necessary measures. I think we need to think about that. And Now let me finish up by saying a few words about East Asia, because the title of this session is Reconfiguring US-China Relations. I think reconfiguration is up to the US and China. It's not for third parties. Even if there is a single-minded coalition of countries which want to prevent clashes between the two titans, I don't think US and China will listen to us. But there is going to be a collateral damage that comes from the US-China conflict, particularly in East Asia, where neither of the two titans wants to concede. And we have seen so many dilemmas, and we are now facing Huawei and South China Sea, an Indo-Pacific strategy, and so on and so forth. I think down the road, ultimately winner between the US and China is not going to be who is more militarily strong, but rather who is going to be perceived as more benign, who is more willing to respect and value the sovereignty of the countries in the region. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the great insights you provided us. I would like to ask a question to Professor Richard Cooper. What do you think about the current trend of decoupling of the US economy and Chinese economy? Some people are saying that it will lead to the restructuring of global production network, and it seems to be undesirable, and I think you are the right person to answer that question. What will be the future in that regard? Actually, I began my graduate study in the United States by reading your writings on economic interdependence. So, please.
Well, this is a question about the future, which is always conjectural. My best guess is that such decoupling will not take place, other than what would take place naturally. Some decoupling is taking place anyway, insofar as Chinese wages are growing, like Korea's did 30 years ago, and many industries that Korea pioneered in exports passed out of Korea because Korea could not produce competitively anymore. And the same thing is happening with China, and more European and American investors are going to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, and to other countries. So that's in the nature of Chinese development and the global consequences of Chinese development in this respect recognized by wage growth. So that's a natural and ongoing process, but I think that apart from that, Chinese and the American economy will become more and more integrated over time, not less. Now, it's true that if you read the newspapers these days, you get the opposite impression. And it is also true that some of Trump's advisors explicitly wanted decoupling of the economies of China and the US. But they are not determinative. They're influence, but not determinative. And my guess is that this too will pass. That's my own view on the question of decoupling. I'm an educator. We have, as has been mentioned, over 300,000 Chinese students in the United States. Some of them will remain in the US. Some of them will go elsewhere. More and more are going back to China. And they know the way that things work, the way things work in the United States. And they will maintain their contacts and their connections with their not just American, but international colleagues that they've made friends with during their, whatever it is, 4 or 6 years studying in the United States. That's a powerful influence, but it's a long-range influence, not going to be recognized next year or the year after, but 30 years from now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Feigenbaum, and I'd like to ask a question. You mentioned that nowadays the logic, the security logic began to lead at economics. And what do you think about after, at the post-Trump era? We will be able to return to the normal, or are we entering a new period which is irreversible in that kind of trend or something like that?
I guess the answer to that question depends in part on what you think is normal. Because to my view, if you're talking about Asia, the region isn't static. So you can't just look at a post-Trump scenario, think that you're going to throw the reverse switch on US policy and that the region will not have changed at all in that time. When I think about, I've said something like this on this stage before, but when I think about the role the United States played in this region in the post-World War II period, but particularly after the early 1960s, the US was a leader because it was the principal provider of security-related public goods through alliances, forward-deployed military presence, things that kept the peace in the region. But it wasn't just a security actor, it was also a provider of economic-related public goods and other benefits. It was a source of demand for Asia's export-led economies to power their way to prosperity. And it was a leader on trade and investment liberalization and standard setting regionally and globally. So in the security realm, until China and Japan have a moment like France and Germany, have a Franco-German moment, there's really no basis for collective security in the Pacific. And so the United States was, is, and as far as I can see, going to continue to be a principal provider of security-related public goods and benefits, either directly through alliance relationships or indirectly for pretty much everybody in the region except for China. But the economic structure in the region has changed a lot and will change even more on a 5, 10, 15-year time horizon. If you look at Asian economies becoming demand drivers for one another, becoming capital exporters, not just capital recipients, the pillars of American economic leadership in the region would have to change and adapt, but the US, at least in terms of the president's trade policy, seems to be walking away from some of that. TPP is an interesting example, it seems to me, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because if you remember the way President Obama used to talk about it, was a little bit like the way you, Jeho, talked about it as being a contest between two powers. Partly it was for domestic effect, but he used to say something like this. He'd say, if the United States doesn't write the rules, China will write the rules. So by logical extension, when the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China should have stepped into the vacuum to be the rule writer. But that's not what happened, right? What happened was that Japan and Australia and the TPP at 11 defined, albeit with a lot of American influence on the text, an alternative pattern. So there are more than two players here in the future of the region. The region's changing. And so in a post-Trump scenario, you can't just throw the reverse switch because the pillars of what make the region tick will have changed, and the US will have to adapt its role to some of that. So that's what I've been most critical about in Washington and a lot of my writing, is I don't see the American policy being particularly adaptive. And what we have now, we don't have any sense of strategy, at least I have no sense of strategy. What I see is an attitude, not a policy, and certainly not a strategy. A strategy is you define a realistic but workable version of the end state, and then you match means to ends. What we have is an administration that has an attitude, more confrontation with China, relying on instruments of hard power, and essentially they've kind of declared open season on China, to use a hunting metaphor, and they've, issued hunting licenses to various agencies. And if you give hunters a hunting license, they will hunt. And so various agencies are coming up with various ways to hunt. But that's not a strategy, and I don't see the US adapting quickly or reflexively enough to some of these structural changes. So the answer to your question is, after this president does the United States adjust its policy, particularly on the economic side of its leadership, in a way that reflects the new power realities, which are not just about the US and China, and where the US role will decline in relative terms, even if it increases in absolute terms? I don't think we know the answer because so far the signs are not good, I think, from either side of our political spectrum.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Chang, you focused on the nature of trade conflict between two big powers. Some people say, including one presenter in this panel, are saying that the trade conflict will last longer than we expect because this is not just about trade imbalance, this is about economic model. I mean, people say that Chinese economic model is authoritarian developmental model, and the US side, I mean, cannot accept that kind of model in now and in the future. So my question is, what is the thinking on that argument in China? I mean, what is the Chinese perspective on that specific view?
I think it's generally in China, of course, among the experts and scholars, even to some extent the policymakers always have debate on the issue, kind of issue, what kind of a Chinese economy, economic system or Chinese system should be. I think, China changed from one different system to another. So this transition have two factors. One is background of socialism. You have to consider. You cannot just simply give up. The second, Chinese traditional system. And more and more seems come back to China. So, and the third important factor that is most important, that China has now integrated with the world. China is no longer isolated, economically and even politically. So you have to consider all the kind of, so the three key factors, I think, how to put them together, which factor will play the key role in some stages, what kind of a formulation for the longer future, still there is no clear answer. I think the three factors they have to put together. So this kind of change is different from traditional model because we have already traditional model of East Asia model from authoritarian to a democratic, and with economic taking off and developed it. But China is different. It's different from that previous, Four Dragons model. So that's a challenge. There are two basic questions, I think. One is how China itself to adjust this changing world, changing China. Changing world, I think China become a giant. And changing environment, that is China has integrated with outside world. So it's unlike in the history. So China, how, need a longer time, I think, before for certain is what kind of a model it is. There is some rough designing, as I mentioned by Cheng. So we have 19th Party Congress, we have three steps. One, 2020, and this mentioned the poverty, and the 2035 become a more modernized society. 2050 become, a comeback China as a most advanced country, and so on. Quite rough designing, but how to fit these three steps? Still, you need a lot of things to fill in. That's one thing. Another, as I mentioned by Evan, so how the world accept this kind of sudden, quick change. China suddenly become number 2 economic and great influence. So world system has not quickly adjusted, especially the United States. If you see the vote rights in IMF and in other international organizations, so China, to some extent, forced change. So have to create, its own initiative, and World AIIB, BRICS Bank and Belt and Road, so which now most of them are rejected by the United States. So it's not China alone. I try to set up some new, or you change the existing international system, like Asian Development Bank, and initiated by Japan. But Japan now already become number 3, and China become number 2. Whether you can restructure it, it seems not possible. So that is part of the story, AIIB. So I think how to adapt to this, it's two kind of stories.
Okay.
I think it's
Thank
still
you.
quite debatable. But one direction, final word, I think China will have to move one clear direction, that is market-oriented economic system. So a reduced or readjusted government role in economic behavior.
Thank you. Professor Chu Chi, you provided some interesting insights on the U.S. security or foreign policy from Chinese perspective. My question is, there are some people in the West thinking that Chinese power has not just strengthened in the recent decades, but at the same time, the Chinese leaders are more willing to show off the China's strengths. And that may be causing some concerns in neighboring countries. For example, in the European history, Otto von Bismarck, German chancellor, after the unification of Germany, was very prudent, skillful, and careful not to frighten Germany's neighbors. So what is your response to that kind of view of outsiders?
We always say one country's foreign policy is extension of domestic policy. It's domestic policy. I think China is also in the case. Actually, if in retrospect, we always, in China, people always think we had suffered a lot in the recent history, in the 100-year negotiation period. So China's policy actually is promoting some principles. The major one is no interference in other countries' domestic affairs. Even China becomes stronger than before. China is insistence this policy, and it has never changed. If you look at China's behavior in the trade union and China's bilateral relations with other countries, I think China has never changed this mind, without interference with other countries' domestic affairs. Even in the so-called Belt Road initiative, China's purpose is to be more actively involved in the international development instead of, using its power to influence other countries or to impose China's standards on other countries. If talking about Sino-American relations, recently, President Xi said in the meeting, in the summit in Osaka, that the two countries cannot separate each other in this current international relations, and we will lose if without cooperation. And China actually often mentioned that the Chinese policy towards the U.S. is no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. And I think for many years this has not changed. Right now, the Sino-American relations in face of a lot of difficulties. It's not caused by the Chinese side, but caused by the U.S. side, especially the Trump administration's new doctrine, American First. I think the whole world has suffered this new doctrine, not only China, but also EU and American partners in Asia, Japan and Korea. I think you have to also face these problems. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Byung-il, you succinctly explained the nature of trade tension between two big powers. I mean, as a Korean, I'm curious about what kind of survival strategy can we adopt as a Korean? I mean,
Well, you're putting me hot spot. Well, I think survival strategy is quite clear to the eyes of strategists. That is, first of all, I think Korean policymakers should recognize we have moved away from familiar territory. That was the US and China. They tried to find mutually beneficial outcome despite differences. Those days are something, the very distant past. So that is going to make policymakers to recognize what is going to be emerging new terrain. That is something what I call new normal. So in this year, new normal, I think Korean should define what is our national interest. National interest. That is, our security is the utmost priority, or our economic gain is equally important priority. I think all subsequent strategy really depends on. For instance, a question about Huawei. I think Korean side is pushed by US and China to choose your positions. I think if Korean comes with that recognition, strategy choice is very clear. And if I was strategist, I try to look for building more network and more firewalls, because we are living through all this, the chaotic situations, all those past agreements, all those rules, all those code of conducts are being ignored and not recognized. So in that context, Korea should find more strategic partners and strategic allies. So should connect it through more other countries. But what is happening in Korea right now is to the contrary of those my wish. So.
Thank you very much. Professor Chung, you explained the nature of hegemonic competition and between the United States and China and international power structure related to that subject. What is your view of the possibility of both countries, the United States and China, cooperate and form a kind of rule of game or modus vivendi, in international, relations, so that we can have more stable international situation in this region and in the world.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I think there is room for cooperation between Washington and Beijing. I used to believe that room was very big, but I think in recent years I tend to believe it has been shrinking. But if you look at the history of US-China relations for the last 20-some years, there are some cases, important cases of cooperation, but that cooperation usually took place in non-security arenas and non-East Asian regions. So that is exactly why the US and China cannot resolve the North Korean issue, while they were successfully in bringing nuclear materials out of Nigeria last year. So I think there is room, but I think East Asia seems to be an exception to that rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have 3 questions from the floor, and 2 are for Professor Zhang Yuling, and one is the question reads like this: do you feel total war is going on between the US and China and cannot be stopped unless and until one finishes off the other completely? You understand this question? And another question is, what kind of methods can China find as a way of reducing huge trade imbalance? Because that has been the concerns of international society. For example, I mean, he mentioned some possibility of opening up capital market, or deregulating import control, or prohibiting government subsidies, or something like that. So I would like to invite your view on those 2 questions. And probably either Professor Cooper or Mr. Feigenbaum. There's another question. I mean, according to this person, a university student, I mean, one of the fundamental problem nowadays is that more and more countries, in more and more countries, we can find a kind of strengthening statistic or populistic, movement, mainly led by the state, according to this person. And is there any way to handle the kind of situation? What kind of solution can we find on this specific issue of populism or statism? Professor Chang first.
Personally, I think China-US is not in a Cold War. I don't use the word yet because the Cold War referred specifically in the character of the United States and Soviet Union. But China-US now is really, I call it comprehensive strategic competition with some confrontal sentiment and actions. So that leaves the question how to manage, how to prevent the 2 countries from the overall confrontation. I use the comprehensive strategic competition. I don't think now in the stage of a confrontation yet. So that is why I think, because both leaders, at least top leaders, understand and know clearly what is the red line. So each side does not want to cross. Try it now until they try to prevent. So the hope is still there. If you see the trade war, they will come back for negotiation, but negotiations is harder than previous stage, but they can't. However, they agree to talk. And economic security issues also, they, are still some rooms there. But the big problem is how to create a new security architecture filled in that changing situation in East Asia side. So that is still a big question. And China recognized the role and existence of military alliance structure. So that means, you see, China officially does not reject that existence. But we have to do something new. How to do? That's still a big question mark. So I don't think, it's easily for China, US go to an overall comprehensive confrontation and to a real war because, the red line is still there. Another changing factor, there are two. One is domestic interest groups. Both sides are very strong. There can all kinds of interconnections, economic, culture, education, every field. And the second, that is regional, or even to some extent global. So they resist the confrontation of China and the United States. If you compare it to the Cold War period, each side has a big group, support each other. But now, almost none. Almost none. Even the US allies, they do not support the US, to take to that. China almost have no country who support that direction. So that leaves the two guys alone, and they have to consider whether we can do. So we have the second, I think, how to reduce China's imbalance gradually. That's the only thing. The only way to do. I think according to the projection, within next 10 years, within 10 years, China may turn to a trade deficit rather than surplus. Because if you see the quite quick restructure of the regional production network. And so the China's trade surplus is not an issue of China, it's a regional. It's all we understand. It's production network. So China become a center and final stage for export. And linked to Japan, linked to Korea, linked to the United States, Europe, and so on. So they need a gradual change of that. So my first question when I raised how to handle or manage this kind of trade imbalance and the balance, and still a big question because who can supply the money in the future? Maybe digital money in the future, not the United States. We don't know. Now emerging public currency now within 10 years, I think it will probably do that. So that means can afford some kind of probably trade imbalance in some instance. So this new issues we are thinking about how to find a way. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Cooper, would you answer?
I didn't get the core of the question that was being asked.
Populism, the issue of populism or statism?
I have nothing useful to say about the source of populism. I have nothing useful to say about that. People are dissatisfied, and when the dissatisfaction reaches a certain point, it shows up in democracies, in elections. And that's happened in a number of European countries. It's happened with the voting for Trump. It has been rejected in a few European countries. But I have no useful thing to say either on the sources of populism. I can speculate, of course, on how to undo it. Maybe Evan does. But I want to say something to agree very strongly with Mr. Young. The term Cold War has been introduced often in the discussion these days. It's obviously used by people who know nothing about the Cold War as it exists in history. There were long periods of time in which the official exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States were only on arms limitation issues. Otherwise, it was through the press and public speeches and proxy wars in other parts of the world. The situation between China and the US is radically different from that Cold War. So it's a historical metaphor, and it's the wrong metaphor. And it should not be used, or at least it should be called Cold War Point 2, recognizing that Point 2 has nothing to do with Cold War Point 1. So I agree very strongly with what he says on that.
You want me to? Yeah, I mean, I would reinforce this with one point, and then I'll take one of the two questions. I think there are a lot of bad metaphors being thrown around all over the place. Just take, Zhou Qi mentioned that, you mentioned national security strategy, you used the word revisionist. Yeah, China is a revisionist, but it's a highly strategic revisionist in my view. And some of our national documents in the United States have had a tendency, for example, to confuse a revisionist power with a revolutionary power, one that seeks to overturn the structure and rules of international order wholesale, which China quite clearly does not. And I know that because we've had a revolutionary China within the lifetimes of people sitting on this stage, not just in this room. Mao Zedong's China in the 1960s and 70s had a revolutionary foreign policy that sought to promote class struggle and proletariat solidarity, to promote revolutionary movements in places like Bolivia and Borneo, that was not a member of any international institution, and it isolated its own social and economic system. So today's China is quite clearly not that China. Structurally, China is integrated. Normatively, there are differences between China and the United States and others about how those structures should operate, according to what standards, what rules, and that's where the competition is. So that's not revolution, it's revision, but it's strategic revision, and on the US debate, there's a tendency to conflate those. And there are issues on the Chinese side too. I wanted to take that one question. There was a question about total war and the two countries finishing each other off. I'll just say, to talk about total war in the nuclear age is an absurdity. And for countries where people talk very casually about limited war, people on both sides who talk about limited war should be thinking about escalation control because of what I just said about total war. And it seems to me, and we have some retired and maybe active Chinese military officers on future panels, there's a lot of casual war talk on all sides. And one thing that would be useful would be for people on all sides to think in a more systematic and disciplined way about the relationship between security, competition, and conflict because of that. Having said that, I think the challenge for the United States and China, therefore, is to find some version of regional and international order that is workable, not just for each other, but for the region. And this gets back to the point about decoupling or divorce. Divorce works when you're in a couple, but the United States and China are not, in fact, a couple. Other countries get a vote, which was the point I was trying to make about TPP. In the economic realm and even in the security realm, countries will pursue their national interests. My friend Jaishankar, who's now the External Affairs Minister in India, was on a panel at a dialogue about a year ago, where he was pushed by a very prominent American who said, it is time for India to make choices. You should choose sides, America's side or China's side. And Jaishankar responded, India will choose sides. We'll choose India's side. It's the answer that I think every country will come up with. And the US and China will need to be mindful of that. And that, as I was saying in answer to an earlier question, is going to shape regional order, but also how adaptive or non-adaptive, as an American, I think American foreign policy will be, and therefore American relevance in the region.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for us to wrap up our discussion. I wouldn't try to summarize what we have discussed, and I think we couldn't solve all the problem, but I think we discussed various aspects of in the U.S.-China relations, and that helped a lot. In terms of understanding the nature of the unique period of confusion and anxiety and uncertainty that we are facing nowadays. Thank you very much for your very insightful comments and contribution. And thank you very much for participating in this very useful dialogue. Thank you.